one of the most exciting things about the flexibility we were given to do this conference is the broad range of perspectives. So we're going to switch from philosophical thinking at its best, at its most distilled, most abstract, to very practical, very close to the ground thinking. Although maybe Dr. Jetty will have some philosophical comments for us too. So we're going to hear from Dr. Bruce Jetty, a conversation between Dr. Bruce Jetty, one of the most experienced technology developers in, I believe, in the Army's history, at every level, from program manager to Assistant Secretary of the Army for ALT. In conversation with Dr. Sarah Krebs, who I will let introduce Dr. Jetty. Sarah is the John Wetherell Professor in the Department of Government at Cornell and the Director of the Cornell Tech Policy Lab. Her work focuses on the intersection of international politics, technology, and national security. She's written books on an extraordinary range of subjects, including Taxing Wars, the American Way of War Finance, Drone Warfare, and most recently, Social Media and International Relations. And she's also done some work on artificial intelligence. And between 1999 and 2003, she was also an active duty officer in the United States Air Force. Sarah, thank you for coming today.
Thank you, Jonathan. I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this amazing lineup. And I'm delighted to meet Dr. Jetty, unfortunately not in person. He currently serves as the president and CEO of Innvistra, LLC. Prior to establishing this company, he served as Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology, where he led the execution of the Army's acquisition function and acquisition management system. He graduated from the U.S. Military Academy with a Bachelor of Science degree in Nuclear Engineering and Chemistry. And he has both a Master of Science and PhD in Material Science and Electronic Materials from MIT. He's taught at Georgetown University, and he is a decorated veteran of 28 years of active duty. He retired as a colonel following a career that included armor and cavalry company commands, 2 overseas tours, battalion and brigade staff assignments, and operational deployments to Afghanistan, Iraq, and Kuwait, during which time he received numerous military awards and commendations. So welcome, Dr. Jetty.
Well, Sarah, thank you. And I'd maybe there's an opportunity at some point when we can sit down. I'd love to hear some of your background as well and share some ideas.
Great. So we're happy to have you here. And where I'd like to kind of lead off, and just to put my cards on the table, I was not just in the Air Force, but I did acquisitions in the Air Force. So I'm very sympathetic to the challenges that the military faces in trying to rapidly deploy new technologies. So what I wanted to do is start with a conversation about so much technology right now that's in the news in a lot of different arenas. But I'd like to start with Ukraine, where we're seeing a lot of either new technologies used or mainstreaming technologies. And it seems like one of the ones that has received kind of the category of technologies that's gotten a lot of attention, not just over in Ukraine, but from US policymakers, are drones. And I'm curious kind of how you're reading the impact of drones in Ukraine and from a variety of perspectives, both the kind of operational and tactical, but also how should we think of these in the context of the conversation we're having here about the ethical use of technologies?
Well, let's see. There are a number of ways to approach the discussion. I don't have any, since I left the government, I still have my clearances, but I don't have any special data. So you're going to get an assessment made from Bruce Jetty, watching the same news you watch, perhaps with a slightly different eye. So I see a good number of tanks, Russian tanks, where the turret is sitting on the ground next to a burned up hull. I look at the turret, and you look around the side of the turret, and the Russians put on reactive armor. They're blocks with explosive between 2 metal plates, and they are supposed to disrupt either a shape charge penetrating the hull or by an explosion or a sabot round, long rod penetrating. Same thing. If you look at the ones sitting on the ground, most of them don't have any of those blocks damaged. The only way then you're going to attack a tank is a top attack. So the Javelin has a top attack capability. It comes into the tank, it pops up and then slams down on the top of the tank, doesn't get into the fight with the reactive armors and the thickened armors that are in the front 60-degree slopes of these vehicles. So it takes advantage of a smart way to attack the vehicle because you can't make every part of a tank as thick as the front, for example. Well, you've got the basic weapon, the Javelin, and it comes out and does their top attack, and it's destroying tanks. All the effort that went into this passive reactive armor is not doing them much good right now. The other piece is, particularly the Turkish government sold or gave to the Ukrainians a large number of UAVs, which also are capable of firing a missile from the UAV, and it comes down and it does a top attack. You've heard some discussions about Switchblade 300s and Switchblade 600s lately, and the U.S. military has transferred at least 100 of them to the Ukrainians. These are small. It looks like a Pringles can, a little longer than a Pringles can, but basically a Pringles can. And there's a little UAV in it that pops out, goes up, and it's a loitering munition. It circles under the control of the operator. When he finds a target, he dives down on top of it and he penetrates. Now, the 300 is not going to penetrate a tank. The 600 will. But the 300 would take out their multiple rocket launchers. It would take out a towed artillery, wouldn't take out the self-propelled. If you look at the Russians, we often look at warfare and think they're going to behave like us. But the Russians actually are almost exactly opposite us. We use the maneuver forces to attack the enemy forces. And when we do, it's relatively surgical in character. We're aiming to try and destroy the enemy forces. And those maneuver forces have precision weapons, et cetera, and all of our artillery is in support of the maneuver. The Russians are the other way around. They take the artillery, they put volume fire out there. Precision's not a real big thing for them because they're going to just rubble the city. And once they rubble the city, the maneuver forces come through. So what is happening, I believe, is that those precision weapons that we have actually have turned out to be pretty effective, not just for their offensive character that they were originally designed for, but in a defensive role when the enemy comes to you and leaves themselves vulnerable with top attack. So UAVs are, I think you just saw warfare change, because how do you defend all of your systems? We only do perimeter defense of our systems. Now we're going to have to do hemispherical defense of our systems.
I mean, that's really interesting because, and that gets kind of at my comment about new or now kind of mainstreaming technologies, because we've had these technologies on the battlefield in many previous conflicts, and whether it's Libya or Ethiopia or Azerbaijan, but there's something about what we've been seeing that really seems to kind of be changing how we're thinking about the use of drones. And I'm curious, well, I mean, I guess that raises two questions. One is, I've been asked for a long time about drone proliferation. And it seems to me, and I'm curious what you think, whether there's it seems like this technology is really that train has left the station. I mean, it seems hard to imagine that we can now, as these have gotten smaller and kind of more accessible commercial, that it's kind of hard to backtrack on that. And maybe the second question is about, since this is a panel on ethics, how should we think about the ethics of those technologies?
Well, I think you're totally right. The genie's out of the bottle. You can't get it back in. The quadcopters, commercial quadcopters, people have gotten the quadcopters. Terrorists get the quadcopters. We had a lot of problems in various places where the terrorists would take the quadcopter. They literally just take a can, like a can of beans. Take all the beans out, get that can. Perfect fit for a grenade. You take the grenade, you put it in there. You have just a little arm that you can actuate over your little controller system, and I can fly the UAV over. I pull the pin. It's in there. It's held. The can holds the spoon in place. The arm that flips off and fires, sets the grenade into the engagement mode, and they fly it over the target and then hit the button, drop the grenade on troops underneath them. It's easy to do. It takes very little technology. You can order the parts on Amazon. So there's no way to get this back in the bottle. I think that what it's going to do is cause us to have to take a hard look. And you can't just say, well, nobody can have UAVs. It just won't happen. They're used in so many different ways, and they're going to be used in more. And there's going to be more types and heavier ones that are going to be bigger and bigger. And ultimately, I think an awful lot of the military aircraft are going to start taking a hard look at. I can start poking being an Army guy, I can poke the Air Force. I mean, if you take the soft, squishy center out of an aircraft, it gets a lot easier to build. So no pilots in there, you can make aircraft very different from the way they are. So with all of these pieces, you're going to have greater proliferation of UAVs in the fight. Now the second question, part of your question is, how do we keep it ethical? And I think that fundamentally the answer is the same way we do with all of our systems. We look, and now I'm talking about us. Okay, the problem is the enemy gets to vote, and they don't necessarily care about ethics. We're not now that we have UAVs, we're not going to go back and say, this would be a good way to dispense, biological weapons. Why not? Well, we're not going to do that because we're not going to do that ever anyway. We're not going to dispense chemical weapons from it. Now, does that mean that the enemy's not going to do that? Absolutely not. So we need to, it's as much an ethical responsibility on our side to know that the enemy's going to do that type of thing or project that they may, and be prepared to defend against those type of attacks. I don't see UAVs as inherently significantly different in making ethical choices than we do for which weapons we pursue or don't pursue at all now.
So I take your point. I think it's an important kind of observation or suggestion about the ethical responsibility, even in light of competitors playing by different rules. I'm curious then on when you talk about and I agree in a lot of ways that UAVs are not necessarily different from other systems. I'm curious though, when we get into the role of autonomy, fully autonomous weapons, does that change how you think about this? If kind of humans are out of the loop in terms of making those decisions about targeting? Because that's one of these areas where I think, Russia and China have not ruled it out. The US is saying it's not going to take that step. How is that going to look when, another country moves in that or takes that step? How do we think about what our responsibilities are there ethically?
So let me. There's a policy paper about where autonomy is allowed to be accomplished or implement, firing of weapons. There are essentially right now, the last I looked at it, which was a little while ago at this point, but if that policy is still in place, there are a very small set of things which are acceptable as autonomous engagements. One example that is an exception is the CWIS system on the ships that can engage inbound cruise missiles, things like that. You can't get the man in the loop. They won't be able to respond fast enough. We've got just our nerves have a transmission rate, and that's it. And so you've got to put autonomy in certain places if you're going to be able to deal with it. I think that it's a very important point to try and at least begin to get a handle on. And I heard some of the earlier speakers talk about it's not like having a man in the loop guarantees no flaws. Having a man in the loop has shot down airplanes. Having a man in the loop has engaged non-combatants, and having a man in the loop has human beings make mistakes, especially under pressure. Autonomous systems under AI control, they're not emotionally involved with the decision. So therefore, it becomes important on our side to make sure that if we allow the autonomous system to make some sort of a decision on its own, that we know what the left and right boundaries of those decisions are. We're basically doing that right now with cars. Car is a weapon. I mean, it's going 40 miles down an hour down the road, and it doesn't react correctly under autonomous driving conditions to a red light in front of it, and you step off the curb. It's not much different than getting hit by a round from an autonomously engaged rifle. You're going to be toast. So I think that we're beginning in the commercial sector actually to begin sort of addressing some of the ways in which we manage this limitation, what's acceptable risk and what's not acceptable risk. They're even taking a look at, well, by putting autonomous driving in place, will I actually reduce accidents? Because we have a lot of accidents. So will it reduce accidents? I think that what we need to do is begin a serious study on the side of the military to examine what's the probability of reducing our error rate if we have perhaps initially and in certain circumstances artificial intelligence supporting man-in-the-loop decisions, and then make some decisions as to where we should allow robotic operations of weapon systems. I'll give you a quick, simple example of one I think is you got to find something that people can grab hold of and then sort of think through the problem sometimes. A tank, like you said, I was a tanker, and I've actually done tank engagements. They were miles because we didn't have any big wars when I was in, just terrorist stuff, and there were not many tanks. There were no tank battles. But in tank battles, sometimes you both come across the ridge. You see each other, and it becomes a quick draw. Who can get the engagement to occur fastest? As soon as you put a man in the loop, it becomes a reaction issue. And they're called meeting engagements. They are the most dangerous engagements you can have because it's all dependent upon who saw what first, realized whether the sensor system saw something that he should respond to or she should respond to, and then figured out what the response ought to be and then implemented the response. It's time as a weapon. And man in the loop becomes a serious problem in that case. I can fire my weapon more precisely with an automated system than I can with a gunner in the gunner seat. So perhaps what we need to do is take a look at a meeting engagement. How likely is a standard gunner going to engage? What's the maximum number of targets that gunner can engage in a certain amount of time? Could I do the same thing or better with an AI system selecting the targets and engaging them? If I interspersed non-combatant targets in there, would the soldier engage them greater error rate than would the AI system. I can train the soldier, I can train the AI. And I think that we need to kind of start small on something like that, which is relatively straightforward, but we're going to have to do it because they're going to do it. And if I come up over the hill and he comes up over the hill and we both suddenly see you and he's engaging 6 targets precisely per minute and I'm engaging 1, it generally doesn't go well.
So that seems like a different, I mean, so we often talk about autonomy in the same breath as AI, and there is a relationship between the two. But what you're talking about is autonomy, but that isn't, so no machine, well, it's different from, and then just to connect it to the previous panel about whether there are peaceful uses or kind of appropriate uses of AI, this is different than a case where an algorithm has been trained to look for someone that has these hallmarks of a combatant. This is, or would you say that that would be an appropriate ethical use as well?
I think that there may be a time that we get to that. You know, one of the things is, and I'm, you know, having been a instructor at Georgetown, I got it. Sometimes I get professorial as well. We're nowhere near that. It's a good idea to think about those challenges, but I think that there are a lot of pathways we can go down that'll inform what that real answer to something like that is before we ever get there. Being able to pick out the one bad guy in a crowd, we have exercise software that will look at a crowd and find the one person that looks a little different. Well, is that because that person's a terrorist, or is that because that person forgot his cell phone, you know, and is going the wrong way to go back to get it, or drop something, or there's too many complexities we haven't gotten through yet to make sure that we remove all the contextual errors. I think that the first place, if you want to talk about weapons being able to engage in an autonomous manner, you simplify the problem to an initial stage that preferably reduces the overall error rate if you have a soldier in the loop. And you do that in a sequential manner, and then you look at the next harder problem. What happens if there's a tank in amongst, an enemy tank in amongst, in a town? What if the town has a yard full of pipes and they put decoys out there to make the tank it look like tanks are in different places, stick them on cars? Do I shoot all the cars? You know, okay, no, I've got to up my quality of my algorithm to be able to discern a true tank from decoys. So these type of things. I sometimes worry that we're trying too hard. Let's see if we it's not easy to get this stuff to work at all. So let's get it to work sort of good, and then we work our way forward from there.
So I think it's a great point, but the counter argument to that is if you don't design in ethical approaches into the system from the outset, you might end up in an outcome that wasn't intended. And I teach a class on tech policy, and we talk about this all the time, about technologies that were developed, and well, let's see if we can do it. Okay, we can do it, and then kind of it's a runaway train, rather, as opposed to, and actually it's a question, is in what way should we be thinking about bringing kind of ethicists into the design of technologies, or is this truly just a technical problem that militaries need to solve first?
No, it's not solely a technical problem. I was a vocal proponent of addressing this issue. How do we want to ethically begin employing artificial intelligence in our weapon systems? Mm-hmm. I think that we don't have a clear policy developed, or even a clear draft of a policy developed that really gives us not just a heading, but something to debate on. You need something that begins to be the point where people get in get to look at it, get to read it, get to start thinking about it, and get to start putting some new thoughts together on it that may not have been in there, and then see how that impacts our weapon systems. But I think often we can think ethereally about things and come up with very good thoughts, but the opposing side is, what can I get done, and what, because eventually I have to take that policy concept and turn it into something that is real. So I'll give you a prime example. Let's say we build, Jetty's tank, and it's got an automated firing system. Does it have just an on button? That's a policy decision. I can make an on button. Does it have a little input where I can say, we're in an area where there are a lot of potential alternative targets to tanks, large trucks, cement trucks, things like that might be maybe would fool the algorithm. And I don't want to shoot people with their cement trucks because I can't be assured that I separate the enemy from the friendlies physically. It's not they've all left and now it's really basically just enemy and enemy in front of me. Okay, now maybe I need target identification at a 98% probability.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if I knew that the enemy was the only one in front of me, I'm out in the desert and there's nobody out there but me and the bad guys, maybe I could drop that down so that I can, I don't mind wasting a couple of rounds on a decoy, but I want to make sure I don't miss any of the bad guys. So I'm gonna tweak it down to maybe 85% probability. We don't even have so the first thing is I got to get the policy, I got to get it connected up to the technology. I've got to get it connected to the technology in some manner in which there's a linkage between the policy and what I want, what I have as an expectation on outcome. And then there's one layer more that we really haven't addressed yet, I believe, which is, okay, so how do you do a command and control of that? Who says when 85 is good enough or you got to be at 98%?
Mm-hmm.
And when do they say that? And what parameters do they go by? It's a rules of engagement issue, but rules of engagement are you can't do this or you can do that. They're not, well, you probably can, or you might be able to. And that's a very different way of looking at real operational issues. And we haven't trained our senior leaders or even any of our leaders to incorporate that into their thinking when they do their operational planning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what we've seen, I mean, coming back to your point about how sometimes humans are more error prone than machines, what I think we also see is in some ways greater tolerance for human errors than machine-based errors. For example, in the autonomous vehicle space, where it's like there's one accident and now we're putting this on hold for some time. And so it's also a curiosity how this would translate into a battlefield setting, whether there would be greater tolerance for the human error, and that only would need to be 85%, but the machine needs to be 99.99% accurate for that to be fielded. And I guess that raises questions of accountability as well. So who is held, we have the UCMJ for, for people, but what's the accountability mechanism when it's a machine?
You're exactly right. I mean, take a look at the first Gulf War. There was something like, and I'm trying to remember some of my numbers, but it was like 100 casualties during the first Gulf War, and almost all of them were fratricide. There in some cases the fog of war makes it difficult to avoid them as a human being because you have limited input. Usually your eyes are the primary sensors. Obscured, you could be told somebody's someplace and they're not. People sometimes report the wrong locations, things like this. Next thing you know, you've got all these little errors start adding up. With an artificial intelligence system, it might be able to improve. We might be able to improve the context of the battle space. Yeah, Jetty's really bad at land nav. he keeps reporting he's in a particular place, but his GPS system keeps reporting back to me that it's not. And it's confirmed he's not, he's over there. So don't shoot that because that's Jetty. And he's just a bad land nav. Now, I may have set my system up to say, if you see a tank, shoot it at 85%. But we can put these other parameters, context parameters in there. So there's a larger systems concept that we can and should be incorporating into this. But my concern is that we're not developing that discussion very well.
No, I think that is well taken. I want to shift a little bit to kind of pivot to this question I have from the audience on battlefield information systems. And I think this is to you in your capacity in acquisitions, and whether the Army's goals for battlefield information systems have changed since the 90s, and whether the Army is getting better at acquiring them.
But yes, they've changed quite a bit since the 90s. I mean, I'm not sure if you're talking about the end of the 90s or the beginning of the 90s, but I'll just take the end of the 90s, because in the beginning of the 90s, it was basically a handheld radio, or not a handheld radio, because they were pretty big. But you want to communicate on the battlefield, you want to tell people where they were, you want to tell what you think the range to a target is, you pick up the hand mic and you talk. The digitized Army is significantly different than that today, though not as much as I think we should be. In automated reporting, telemetry on the battle space, telemetry to each other, not just, my engine oil is low. I'm talking about, am I pointing my gun? Is there a way you can help know that I'm a friendly or not? So we have changed quite a bit. And we're trying to find ways to integrate more and more our different levels of communication. One of the big problems with the huge Army that we have, and really it's not just an Army fight, it's a joint fight. So I've got to get sensor data from Air Force platforms down into a vehicle. The Air Force doesn't have anything that talks to the ground vehicles. So I've got to find a way then digitally transfer the data and then get it into the vehicle. There's a great deal of data that the Army generates that is useful to the Air Force. I need to get it across bounds. The Air Force's communications architecture is totally different than the one that the ground forces have. Same thing with the Navy. The Air Force working on JADC2 as a concept is a great idea. Don't think I think it's useful. It's very useful for the Air Force, a little problematic for the Army. I mean, basically all the sensors get all the data, bring it in, supercomputer crunches it, sends back out who should know what. If you added all the planes in the Air Force, it's less than 2,000, okay? I got more than those vehicles in a battalion. So I can't get all that and all that data anywhere, crunch it, and then send it out from some, Montana. That won't work. So I'm going to have to do a lot of computation at the edge. So there are a lot of architectural issues that still have to be worked out, because my AI architectural issues that get resolved at the edge of the battle space are still going to have to be part of feeding into JADC2. But you can't take all the data from me because you just clog up everything. So I think we're improving. But number one, I think that the problem's a lot more complicated than people may think, because they tend to grab a particular idea and then stick with it. I don't know if that helps get an idea of.
Yeah, no, that was great. I guess on the topic of information and coming back to Ukraine, one of the really interesting things to watch is just the role of open source information or intelligence, OSINT. And just, this is maybe less of an ethical question, but more kind of how that changes. And this is not a war that the US is directly involved with, but it's something that kind of like an adversary using drones and leveling the playing field, open source and intelligence now seems like it's just kind of exploded, and so I'm curious about the kind of pros and cons of that, and how, if the U.S. is involved in this in a conflict in the future, what we can learn from what we're seeing in Ukraine right now.
Again, I got no secret sauce, so I can say almost anything I want because it's my opinion. I'm somewhat amazed at the Russians who are supposed to be 10 feet tall in cyber and controlling what information can get to who. If you look at this, they really haven't blunted the communications of the Ukrainians, and they're doing info ops that's just inspiring.
Yeah.
If this is all done and their president wants to retire from being the president, he probably can get a really good advertising job someplace. But
well, and I guess that's part of maybe the flipping the question, but in a more kind of fruitful way, which is that it seems like the U.S. can learn a lot from how Ukraine is kind of using the very visible aspect of this war on social media to in its favor. I mean, it seems like I'm trying to think of the U.S. experience with this, but it strikes me that Ukraine has really taken that to the next level in a way that has elevated the country and its cause in the court of international public opinion. I mean, in a way that's really important information operations kind of way.
I totally agree. They're setting the standard. I don't know that we are prepared to be able to behave the same way that this little country in Europe is behaving. You know, about the size of Texas, and they would probably run rings around us on information warfare too right now. They're doing a superb job, and if we're not taking notes, shame on us.
Completely. So along those lines, an audience member asked how the war in Ukraine has changed your mind about the Army's technology funding priorities.
So I mentioned earlier, most of our concepts for we've moved away from just purely looking at things. First of all, M1 tank weighs about 80 tons. The Russians, if you shoot the Russian tanks or Chinese shoot an M1 is still the best tank in the world. You hit that tank with a long rod penetrator, which is probably the hardest thing to deal with. They'll never penetrate the front 60 degrees on that tank. So as long as I'm facing the enemy, I'm impervious to the enemy. But I still have that thin layer on the top. I've got some perimeter. If they start shooting from the sides, there's a point at which 60 degrees is no longer 60 degrees. You're past 60 degrees. So we've gone to adding active protection systems that can take an inbound missile, for example, that's coming at you from the side and shoot it down. So we move from passive defense. We then move, the really passive defense is a whole lot of armor. Still have a lot of that on the M1. The next level was passive defense in the form of, it's semi-active defense in the form of also these exploding bricks, so to speak. But they just sit there and you have to trigger them by impacting them. The level we've gone to now is to do an active defense, which ends up basically to shoot from around us. We're probably going to take the round out of the air. Okay. Where we still are struggling is with the top attack portion of that. There are programs that are going to have been in development that can provide top attack protection. That was not seen as that big a priority. I think it's going to change because you've got to have top attack protection, period. We saw a lot of top attack as protection with counter rockets, artillery, and mortar, CRAM. And, you know, we've just finally gotten to the point where we can deploy directed energy lasers primarily on the battle space, 150 kilowatt and 300 kilowatt coming. Those can address some top attacks. Yeah, well, now we need to relook. How do we provide that not as sort of this semi-permeable bubble over a company or a battalion? How do I give each vehicle a bubble? And what weapons can I put on there? Do I need to put a laser on every tank? If so, how do I deal with that? Do I need to put an RF jammer on every tank? If so, how do I deal with that? So I don't think we've gotten there, and I think that we're going to have to really start addressing those issues quickly.
So we have about 2 minutes left, and I wanted to ask one last question. And this is for you to hold the Jetty crystal ball and tell us what the next war that the U.S. is involved with will look like, and what, again, tying us to our panel theme, the pressing ethical considerations of that kind of war will face us with.
Good. Is it one we've funded or one we should fund?
Respondent's prerogative. You answer it however way you'd like.
Yeah, I'm gonna answer it sort of in the manner of we should fund. So you should have I believe that you're going to need all the weapon systems that we currently have in some form or fashion are going to end up still being out there. We're going to make sure that we keep certain things on our side. We're just not going to use it. We have no chemical weapons. We physically have some chemical weapons, but they're in destruction and they'll meet the treaty obligation in 23. So we'll never bring them back to the battlefield. Never have biological weapons. We're not going to deploy blinding weapons. There are an ethical pathway that we're going to go down where we have said these things are unethical on the battle space. We're going to hold to that. So I'm comfortable there. I think that we need to, the next battle, a truly well prepared for battle would be one that has an ongoing run in the background. So you're actually fighting the war all the time in case, so that you can find whether or not there is a looming battle. Is it real? So can I develop artificial intelligence? I think there was the professor before me was talking about examining pre-war environments. How can I find out when we're approaching a war situation, and can AI support me making some of those decisions? Once I look at it and say, of course, this should be prepared before you get there, but when I get to the point where I say I need to be prepared to do something, I should have already had my scenarios being run on an AI system that is giving me the 1,000 war game outcomes, so I can assess where do I need to go? What's the best probability? It's going to be human judgment, because it's going to take a long time for an AI system to be as cognizant of the context as is a human being. And then once I get to a point of deciding how I would prepare to fight, there are AI systems that are going to have to be able to be triggered. So, for example, I know that I want to turn off all of their light switches in their public buildings, and I know how to do that. Boom. I know I want to do it in a certain sequence. I want to do it in a certain way and be able to turn other ones back on. And then you start getting into the weapons deployment things. What's my primary targets and my secondary targets? So I think that the application of artificial intelligence to supporting the command and control decisions on the battle space, there are places where man in the loop is absolutely critical. I just don't think that we've matured that yet. And then you get down to the actual weapons deployment piece. when do I fire? How do I fire? How do I get time as a weapon? In other words, I go faster than they can ever go. Those type of things, we need to do this type of a sequence so that I'm always prepared for battle. I always know what they've got. They've got this radio. I know I've got that jammer. I know I can do it within this. I know I'm going to have to get this aircraft this close to that radar before I can do something with a weapon. Okay, well, then what do I do to protect the aircraft? All those analyses we ought to be doing now with AI systems. And then integrate that, just as I talked about. You got a policy and you got an AI concept. How does it turn into something I can actually, sign a check for?
That's wonderful. What a great concluding remark. Let's give another digital round of applause for Dr. Jetty and Professor Krebs. I wish we had another hour, Dr. Jetty, to ask you about Army simulation investments and hear some war stories from you taking PackBot into the caves in Afghanistan. But we'll have to have you back at another point for that conversation. So thank you so much. And then in about 10 minutes at 3:30, we will reconvene for the final panel of the day, our kind of practitioner panel on integrating ethics into technology design.